Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for more true crime story. For decades, their names sat in dusty evidence files. Victims whose stories had long since faded from the headlines. Their photographs, once posted on bulletin boards and police press releases, were now yellowing with age, buried in filing cabinets or boxed away in evidence lockers. The trails had gone cold, as cold. The 1980s and 1990s were rife with violent crimes that shocked communities but left law enforcement puzzled. Police departments had only the tools available at the time: interviews, eyewitness accounts, fingerprints if they were lucky. DNA testing was primitive at best, often requiring large, uncontaminated samples that rarely existed. If the evidence wasn't obvious, the leads dried up. Killers walked free. Families waited decades for answers. Take the case of Deborah Jackson, a young woman found murdered in Texas in 1979. For more than 40 years, she was known only as Orange Socks, named after the only clothing she wore when her body was discovered in a drainage ditch. Investigators worked tirelessly to find out who she was and who had killed her, but the case eventually went cold, with no name and no suspect. It would take genetic genealogy decades later to finally identify Deborah and bring new hope to solving her murder. Or the haunting murder of Sharon Gregory in California in 1981. A young mother stabbed in her home while her toddler cried in the next room. Detectives followed leads and even had suspects, but without physical proof, the case stalled. The killer seemingly vanished. Her family mourned every birthday and anniversary, clinging to the hope that one day justice would find its way back. For those who worked these cases, veteran homicide detectives, forensic experts, and relentless cold case volunteers, the pain of the unsolved never really goes away. Every dead end is a punch to the gut. Every unopened letter from a grieving family member is a reminder of the justice they failed to deliver. And yet, they persist. One such cold case detective, Sergeant Dana Reynolds, described the frustration bluntly. "We knew who we suspected. We knew the motive. But without DNA, without witnesses, it was like screaming into the void." And then something began to change. In the early 2000s, technology caught up with the ambition of investigators. Forensic science underwent a quiet revolution. DNA testing became more precise, even able to analyze degraded samples that had been untouched for decades. New systems like CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, gave investigators a searchable database of offenders. But the real game-changer came in the 2010s: genetic genealogy. Thanks to popular services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, millions of Americans had unknowingly contributed their genetic code to vast databases. While most sought to discover their roots, a few unknowingly were connected to killers. Suddenly, investigators had a new weapon: using distant relatives' DNA to trace a family tree that led directly to the perpetrator. It didn't matter if the killer had never committed another crime or had stayed out of the system. Their DNA, left behind decades earlier, was still there, silent, patient, waiting to speak. By 2018, the game changed forever when Joseph James DeAngelo, better known as the Golden State Killer, was arrested using this very method. For over 40 years, he had terrorized California with a series of rapes and murders. He had eluded capture, despite countless profiles and investigations. But a single DNA match through a genealogy site brought him down. That arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal justice world, and hope through the hearts of families who had waited too long for justice. Cold case units across the country began pulling out old evidence boxes. Technicians carefully opened sealed bags containing bloody clothing, hair samples, cigarette butts, and half-crumpled receipts. Every fiber was now a potential witness. The old rules no longer applied. In Cleveland, a 1984 murder of a high school student was suddenly reopened when touch DNA from the victim's sweater produced a genetic genealogy lead. In Oregon, a decades-old double homicide was solved in under 6 months once DNA pointed to a suspect's long-dead cousin. For some families, closure finally came. Not in courtrooms but in quiet cemeteries, placing flowers at graves they had visited for years, now knowing the face of the monster who had taken everything. But with every new breakthrough came a darker truth. Many of these killers had blended back into society. They married, raised children, paid taxes. Some even worked in law enforcement or volunteered in their communities. It was a reminder that the face of evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it's your neighbor, your coach, or your friend. As the chapter closed on some of these decades-old mysteries, one truth remained: DNA never forgets. And for the killers who thought they had escaped, the future had a way of reaching into the past and dragging them into the light. For most criminals, time is their greatest ally. As the years pass, memories fade, evidence deteriorates, and witnesses disappear. But DNA is different. It doesn't forget. It doesn't lie. And unlike witnesses, it doesn't grow silent with age. DNA remains quiet, resilient, and damning, waiting for technology to finally catch up. In the early days of forensic science, DNA was still a mystery to most. When it was first used in a criminal case in 1986 in England, the world was stunned. A double murder in Leicestershire was solved by comparing DNA from a suspect to biological evidence left at the crime scenes. That moment changed criminal investigations forever. But it would take years, decades even, for that science to become accessible, accurate, and powerful enough to re-examine cold cases across the U.S. By the late 1990s, the FBI had launched CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, a national database of DNA profiles collected from crime scenes and convicted offenders. Slowly, justice departments around the country began uploading DNA from old evidence into the system. But even with this leap forward, there was a problem. If the killer had never been arrested or had died before giving a sample, there would be no match. For many families, hope was still out of reach. That changed with the rise of consumer DNA testing. When companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe exploded in popularity during the 2010s, millions of Americans sent in their saliva to find their ethnic roots or long-lost relatives. Most had no idea their family trees might link to murder. What they didn't know was that investigators were beginning to use publicly accessible DNA databases, like GEDmatch, to trace the family trees of crime scene DNA. This was called genetic genealogy, and it cracked open cases that had been dead for decades. The most famous example? The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, in 2018. For years, he had committed over 50 rapes and at least 13 murders across California. His DNA never matched anyone in CODIS. But when his distant relatives uploaded their DNA to a public database, investigators finally had the lead they needed. They built a family tree, eliminated suspects one by one, and eventually zeroed in on DeAngelo. A discarded tissue from his trash sealed his fate. The ripple effect was massive. Within a year of DeAngelo's arrest, dozens of cold cases across the U.S. were reopened. A 1987 murder of a young couple in Washington. A 1996 rape and murder of a college student in Pennsylvania. A 1973 cold case in Colorado that had haunted a detective's career for 40 years. Each one had the same theme. The killer thought they had escaped, but their DNA, stored for decades in rape kits, under fingernails, or on clothing, remained the ultimate witness. Even touch DNA, left behind from simply grabbing a doorknob or brushing up against fabric, could now be amplified and used to identify a suspect. Mitochondrial DNA from old bones, hair without roots, or even degraded remains in waterlogged graves could now be extracted and tested. In Phoenix, Arizona, the 1984 case of 8-year-old Vicki Lynn Hoskinson was reopened after a DNA breakthrough from a single strand of hair. In Indiana, the murder of 15-year-old Mary E. was solved when investigators used genealogy tracing from a blood-stained shirt, leading to a relative who eventually confessed. But it wasn't just about identifying the killer. DNA exonerated the innocent, too. In some cases, the people imprisoned for years were proven to be victims of flawed investigations or bad eyewitness accounts. The Innocence Project, a nonprofit legal group, has helped overturn hundreds of wrongful convictions using DNA analysis. The very tool that brought justice to the guilty also gave freedom to the innocent. Still, this scientific miracle wasn't without its ethical gray areas. Critics began asking, should investigators be allowed to use consumer DNA data to find suspects? What about privacy? What if someone's cousin submitted their DNA? Should that implicate an entire family tree? Legal debates erupted, but one thing was clear. For grieving families and dog detectives, DNA was hope. Detective Lisa Moreno from Ohio put it simply, it doesn't care how rich you are, how long ago it happened, or how clean you lived your life afterward. If you left it at the scene, it's going to find you. One of the most shocking arrests came in 2019, when a church deacon and grandfather was arrested for the 1972 rape and murder of a teenage girl. For over 40 years, he had lived a quiet life in the suburbs. He coached Little League, volunteered at food banks, and retired with honors. But DNA had never forgotten. Now, cases like these were opening almost weekly across the country. New cold case units were funded. Retired detectives returned to volunteer. Families who once believed their loved ones would never get justice were getting long-awaited calls from investigators. "We found a match," they'd hear. "We have a name. After all these years, we got them." And just like that, a name from the past returned to haunt the present. For decades, they lived among us, unbothered, unnoticed, and unpunished. Some attended church every Sunday. Others hosted barbecues and raised children. A few even served as local law enforcement or community leaders. But behind the smiles and the mundane routines, they carried a dark secret. They had killed someone. And for years, sometimes half a lifetime, they had gotten away with it, until DNA came knocking. One of the most chilling cases involved Jerry Lynn Burns, arrested in 2018 for the 1979 murder of 18-year-old Michelle Martinko. Michelle was found stabbed to death in her family's car outside a mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. At the time, it was a brutal mystery. No witnesses, no surveillance cameras, and no suspects. For nearly 40 years, her murder remained one of Iowa's most notorious cold cases. Then, in 2018, investigators uploaded a DNA sample from the crime scene to a public genealogy website. They built a family tree, working backward from distant relatives until they arrived at Burns. He was a 64-year-old businessman with no criminal record, living quietly in Manchester, Iowa. Surveillance teams collected his DNA from a used straw. It matched. For decades after Michelle's murder, her killer was unmasked, and he had never even seen it coming. Burns' case wasn't unique. Across the country, ordinary-looking people were arrested for extraordinary crimes they thought they had buried forever. In California, 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, the infamous Golden State Killer, had lived an unremarkable life until his past caught up. He had worked as a police officer, married, and raised children. But between 1974 and 1986, he had raped over 50 women and killed at least 13 people. For decades, he eluded authorities, mocking them with letters and silence. He might have died a free man if not for genetic genealogy. In Washington state, Terrence Miller was arrested in 2019 for the 1972 rape and murder of 20-year-old Jody Loomis. He had been a married man, working as a mechanic, his violent past buried beneath years of normalcy. After being identified via DNA, he was set to stand trial. But the night before jury selection began, Miller died by suicide, robbing the courtroom of the justice Jody's family had waited nearly 50 years for. The stories shared a terrifying pattern. Killers who didn't just evade justice, but who thrived in its absence. They didn't live in the shadows, they became fixtures in their communities. Some mentored youth, served in the military, even received awards for community service. And all the while, their victims' families suffered in silence. The psychological twist is brutal. These killers lived two lives. One, a public mask of normalcy. The other, a private legacy of violence and death. And yet, DNA had no respect for the years. It didn't care how respectable they looked now or how much time had passed. One strand of hair, one drop of blood, one careless cigarette, but preserved by time and sealed in an evidence locker, was enough to bring the truth crashing down. Even more shocking were the confessions. Some broke the moment they were confronted with DNA evidence. Others kept denying until the very end. A few even tried to convince themselves it had been too long ago to matter. "That was a lifetime ago," one man told investigators. "I'm not that person anymore." But for the families of the victims, time didn't heal. It hardened. It echoed. Every birthday missed, every graduation, wedding, and holiday. They all carried the heavy shadow of unresolved grief. When these killers were caught, some families rejoiced. Others wept, not just because justice was served, but because it reminded them of all the years stolen without closure. In Colorado, the arrest of James Curtis Clanton in 2019 solved the 1980 murder of 21-year-old Helene Przezinski. She had just started her dream internship when she was abducted, raped, and murdered. For nearly 40 years, the case had gone cold. Then DNA hit a match. Clanton, now a truck driver in Florida, had built a new life, but the evidence told a different story. His double life came crashing down. Perhaps one of the most unsettling cases came from Wisconsin, where Raymond Rowe, a popular wedding DJ, was arrested in 2018 for the 1992 rape and murder of a schoolteacher. Rowe had performed for celebrities, rubbed elbows with politicians, and DJ'd school events. He was a fixture in his community. But the moment investigators tested DNA from a discarded water bottle, the illusion shattered. Each of these cases reinforced the same harrowing truth. Killers walk among us, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. They hide in plain sight, banking on the silence of time. But DNA doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. As more law enforcement agencies embrace forensic genealogy, hundreds of cold cases are being re-examined. Retired detectives return to reopen boxes of evidence. Lab technicians work overtime, scanning old items for biological traces that might still carry the key to justice. And the message is clear. No matter how long it takes, justice doesn't give up. And neither does science. When a murder goes unsolved, it becomes more than a crime. It becomes a wound that never closes. Families carry the weight of unanswered questions. Communities live with fear and suspicion. And worst of all, the victims, those silenced forever, have no voice to speak their truth. But in the age of forensic breakthroughs, DNA has become that voice, even when it takes decades. For many victims' families, cold cases aren't just statistics, they're deeply personal. Each birthday missed, every anniversary without closure, is a haunting reminder of what justice delayed truly feels like. But with the rise of DNA technology, the phrase "too late" has lost its grip. Take the case of Deborah Tomlinson, a 21-year-old college student found strangled in her apartment in 1984. For over 35 years, the case sat cold. But in 2020, her family received a life-changing phone call. Investigators had found a DNA match. The killer, Walter Carroll, had died in 2002. Though he would never stand trial, Deborah's family finally had answers. The weight of uncertainty lifted. Her story, once lost in a sea of unsolved files, now had an ending. Cases like Deborah's reveal a powerful truth. Even when the killer is gone, the truth still matters. It's not just about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about reclaiming a narrative hijacked by violence and silence. That's why law enforcement agencies across the U.S. have launched initiatives dedicated solely to cold case resolution. Specialized DNA units are reopening thousands of boxes, some gathering dust for 40 years or more, looking for hairs, skin cells, or blood samples that technology couldn't detect back then but can now. And in many cases, it's working. In Florida, the 1983 murder of 10-year-old Jeanette Reyes was solved in 2021 using advanced mitochondrial DNA testing. A single hair follicle found in her bedroom, previously unusable, was finally tested with modern methods. It led to a convicted child predator who had lived just 2 blocks away at the time of her death. In Ohio, police solved the 1974 murder of Barbara Rowe, a mother of 2, after a preserved semen sample was reanalyzed using STR, short tandem repeat, profiling, an improvement on the older RFLP method. That single advancement reopened the case and brought closure to a family that had waited nearly 50 years. But it's not just justice for the victims. DNA breakthroughs also bring relief to the wrongly accused. In Illinois, Keith Sims spent 17 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. In 2019, a re-examination of evidence cleared him completely. DNA linked the crime to another man who had died years earlier. Sims walked free, but his case served as a reminder that science can not only imprison, but also exonerate. The future of DNA forensics is even more promising. Scientists are now experimenting with proteomics, the study of proteins in hair and skin, to build biometric profiles of suspects, even when DNA is too degraded. Epigenetics may one day help determine a suspect's age or lifestyle habits from their DNA. Tools like rapid DNA machines are already shortening the testing process from weeks to just hours. But with every new tool comes a question. Where do we draw the line? As forensic genealogy becomes more common, debates rage over privacy and consent. Should your cousin's ancestry DNA submission be used to investigate you? Should law enforcement have unrestricted access to genealogy databases? Some argue it's a slippery slope. Others say it's the price of justice. For now, families of victims say the answer is simple. "We don't want revenge," said Maria Allen, whose sister's 1982 murder was solved in 2020. "We just want the truth. We want to know who did this. We want to know someone cared enough to look." And indeed, someone did. In cities big and small, detectives, forensic scientists, and genealogists are working behind the scenes. Not for headlines, but for healing. They dig through old files, match family trees, and test evidence again and again. Because for every name identified, every case solved, and every truth uncovered, another victim's story is brought out of the dark. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It's justice patiently waiting for science to give it a voice. And now, with every breakthrough, that voice is louder than ever. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell for more true crime story.